don't know what's going on in Putin's head. He seems pretty cornered at the moment. He's 70, he's getting old, so he's lived an incredible life. Maybe that means he cares less about the future. I don't know, I'm just hypothesizing. And, Russia takes its claims to these areas very seriously. I think a lot more seriously than the rest of the world cares about them. Certainly the average person, couldn't care less. They wouldn't know where Donbass is, they wouldn't know where Ukraine is. So it's a very scary situation. It surprises me there's not even a starker fall in stock markets and so forth, because of the prospect of, very serious cataclysmic events. And I think these terrorist attacks on the bridge and the pipelines and all that sort of stuff is making it even more scary because it's humiliating Russia and him, and he doesn't like being humiliated. So yeah, look, I think it's very scary, and I wish the US would be kind of pushing for peace and trying to get some sort of settlement.
Welcome to the New Flesh Podcast, the podcast you deserve. My name is Jonathan Astro, and with me is just plain old Ricky Allpike.
Yep, that's me, plain old Ricky Allpike. Well, today on the cards, we are talking all things US politics. We're also talking about the war in Ukraine with our very good guest, very good friend, Mr. Adam Creighton.
This is our US correspondent.
Yes, our man in the US.
Yes, well, all right, well, I don't know, let's do it.
Adam Creighton is a journalist and the Washington correspondent for The Australian, where he was previously the economics editor. Adam has also written for The Wall Street Journal and The Economist. He's received several awards for his journalism and writing and first appeared on our show back in May 2022. That's episode 110. And we're thrilled to have our man in the US back to tell us what's happening stateside. Adam, welcome back.
Thanks very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
So a general question, just to begin with, what is the political mood like in the States at the moment?
Well, look, as you know, this is such a polarised country, and that hasn't changed. I think the Trump phenomenon did that even more. Whether or not you support Trump, I think you have to acknowledge that it created great polarisation. I mean, the political focus over here right now, of course, especially in Washington, is on the midterm elections, which are coming up on the 8th of November, so a little bit less than 4 weeks away. And throughout the summer, Democrats were getting very excited because, for whatever reason, although most people think it's because of the High Court's a decision about abortion, their political fortunes were steadily improving. The president and the party were creeping up in the polls, and that was reflected in the betting markets here, which I think in about July or maybe the start of August gave the Democrats the greater chance of holding onto the Senate, which is very important. As you know, there's two chambers, just like ours, the Senate, the House of Representatives. They're both controlled just by the Democrats, very slim margins. And it had been the conventional wisdom since Biden took office that Republicans would win both chambers in a landslide in November. And that's no longer the conventional wisdom. Most people still think that Republicans will take the House of Representatives, which is historically what happens. The party not in the White House tends to do well in midterms. But Democrats' fortunes have improved to the point that most people think that they'll keep the Senate. I mean, I personally don't think they'll keep the Senate. And the Senate, by the way, is 50-50. You probably know that. So very, very tight. It's only because the vice president is also the president of the Senate. She has a casting vote, so they have a majority effectively. So the political mood is just intense focus on that. And I guess the ramifications of what happens. So many of the Republican candidates are Trump picks. And so that's going to reflect on Trump himself, obviously, depending on how Republicans do. If they do badly, if they don't retake the Senate, which I think would be very embarrassing, because historically, as I said earlier, the party not in the White House tends to do well in midterms. So if they don't take it, it's going to be very bad for the Republicans. I think reflect badly on Trump. So they're the focuses, I guess, at the moment. Obviously, the economic backdrop is, somewhat scary. We've still got inflation at 8%. Actually, the figure comes out in about 1 hour, actually, for September. So we'll see whether it's starting to fall. What we saw last month, it's not. And I think we've had, plus 8% now for 6 months, which is extraordinary, and more than 5% for 18 months. So there's a serious problem. It's certainly not transitory, as the Federal Reserve Chairman famously said last year. So look, I think the economy is a big focus and the midterms are a big focus.
So not white supremacy?
No, not white supremacy. I mean, I guess if you're reading the New York Times all the time, maybe that's your focus. But, I try to read broad range of media and no, not white supremacy.
Well, we wanted to get a little bit into the war in the Ukraine in just a moment, but you mentioned Donald Trump, and in an article in The Australian recently, you said that the gloss might be coming off the former president, even for some of his dedicated followers. Why do you think that Donald has taken a bit of a dive recently?
Well, look, it's just the sheer number of inquiries and investigations into him. I mean, if you throw enough mud, some of it is going to stick. And that's not to say the inquiries aren't justified. I'm just saying that in a political sense, if you're Joe Average and, you kind of pay vague attention to the media, then you're going to be hearing, oh, God, there's another inquiry, another one. The FBI raided his home, now this, now that. You're going to start to think that he did at least something wrong. And I think that has hit his standing both throughout America and within the Republican Party. I mean, I talk to a lot of Republican strategists here in DC, and honestly, 90% of them, just off the record, they can't wait to see the back of him. But they always say off the record because he's still very powerful. so they don't want to be quoted saying that. But it's pretty clear the party really wants to see the end of him because he's so divisive, and they think that he couldn't win again in 24. I mean, he did lose by, quite a few million votes in 2020. And since 2020, there's a lot more bad stuff happened from the Trump point of view, the Gen 6 riots, congressional hearings, the FBI raid. So they say, do you really think that he could win again? I mean, I tend to agree with them. I don't think he could. And so I think that they're right to hope that he goes away. Then again, he's certainly got, he's dedicated, 25% of US voters or maybe 20% of US voters who absolutely adore him and will go to the rallies and they'll give money. I mean, he's a fundraising extravaganza still. He's got hundreds of millions of dollars in fundraising, which he's just started spending actually just in the last couple of weeks on some of his Senate candidates who are struggling, which is interesting. So look, I think the gloss is coming off. I think the FBI raid really hurt him. Whether you think it was overreach, I happen to think that they should have tried other means sooner before raiding his home. But it seems he did something wrong with the documents. I mean, that's my view. I mean, it's a kind of a silly abstract issue in a sense, but he should have known better.
But what's the hazard though? No one's sending the FBI to rifle through George W. Bush's new paintings and see if there's any pictures of WMDs or whatever hidden in there.
I mean, I wrote a column early on in this, a week after the saga, basically saying, look, this is mountain out of a molehill. He may have technically broke the law, but we all technically break the law every day, and we don't go to jail. So it's a matter of who prosecutes, etc. And look, I'm sure there is some political motivation to it. I mean, he's deeply loathed by the elites in this country, and that includes the Department of Justice, the FBI, certainly the Democratic Party, some people in the Republican Party. I mean, he's a very hated man, and you'd have to think that may have motivated some of this push to convict him. But whatever you think of the merits of the case, I think it's hurt him. So there was all that chatter of him announcing a presidential bid, but he hasn't. So that's kind of interesting.
Well, he's not the kind of guy that likes to lose. And do you think, given that the chances he could lose twice are on the cards if he runs again, that he just won't run?
Yeah, look, I think that's it. I mean, he would not want to lose at all. He'd be so embarrassed and humiliated, especially to Joe Biden again. And I was just talking to a Dem strategist yesterday, and a pretty senior one. He was emphatic Joe Biden will run again, which kind of surprised me. I don't think he will, but I mean, who knows? I mean, it's still 2 and a bit years away, but because you've seen, Biden's mental decline, I think, has been, pretty pronounced and obvious. I mean, it's
are people worried about Joe Biden?
If you look at the polls, I think something like, certainly more than half of Americans think that his mental capabilities have seriously declined.
Because the new stuff he's doing makes corn pop, and the old stuff look like sort of his early work, look quite good.
I mean, it's very entertaining. I mean, Kamala Harris is very entertaining too. I mean, I read a column a few weeks ago, which was a big hit, just saying that this is the funniest presidency ever. Far funnier.
Andy Kaufman style performance of hers. I think it's genius. It's too good to be true.
Genius. It's just so funny. There's almost a new gag every day, whether it's Kamala in North Korea, hailing the US alliance with Pyongyang, or Joe's wife having to escort him off the stage at some speech. I mean, it's just It's really good. It's very
Well,
entertaining.
there's always chatter around whether the Democrats are going to oust Biden early because of that cognitive decline. But do you think he kind of has a bit of a fail-safe because Kamala Harris is, she would take over and she's not very popular. So
That's true. She's less popular than him. The Democrat bench, if you like, is very weak. In fact, it's hard to even think of anyone who's on it.
Newsom.
They're structural. Yeah, well, that's what everyone says.
He's
But it's hard to believe that he's going to be successful nationally, given. I mean, sure, he's popular in California, but that's an unusual. It's an unusual state. It's very left wing, very progressive. I think a savvy Republican could point to a lot of statistics about California and say, "Do you want the US to be like this?" And I think most Americans would say no. So, but look, I mean, it would be very interesting. I mean, he's very charismatic. He's good looking. He's got a lot going for him. So maybe he'll challenge. But if Biden does choose to run again, it would be very unusual for another Democrat to challenge him. I think the last time that happened was with Carter in the whenever that was, 76 or something, when Ted Kennedy challenged him. So it doesn't happen very often. So we'll see.
Before we go global, how much tolerance do you think people have for this culture war stuff on both sides? So, Biden's creepy MAGA Republican speech recently where he had the bright red background, also known as Dark Brandon speech or whatever, and DeSantis's war on Disney. Is this stuff really going to animate the voters?
Well, look, I think the sad fact is that it does, and that's why the hardheads in both parties recommend it, because remember, it's voluntary voting here, so you've got to get the base out, and the way to get the base out is to make them really angry. So that's why the Dems do it, all that semi-fascism nonsense, and the Republicans do it too, with kind of a caricaturing some elements of the left. I mean, to get their base out as well. So. That's maybe one advantage of our system back home, where everyone has to vote. You don't have to worry about doing that, so politicians don't do it.
Yeah, I feel like compulsory voting sort of pulls everyone a little bit more to the centre.
It does,
because politicians have to appeal to a wider base.
I mean, it's got its other problems. I mean, it makes the standard of a political debate extremely stupid, right? Because you have to concentrate on the median person who has no idea and doesn't care. That's the person you're talking to. And so you get the most banal stupidities uttered by our politicians over and over again. And you're reporting on it's very embarrassing and humiliating, because it's just meaningless crap.
I saw a story today.
That's what I have to do.
I saw a story today of Albo arguing with the Dominic Perrottet, the New South Wales Premier. They were arguing about taking a sign off a rugby stadium, and two schoolboys, they look pissed as well, by the way. And it was ridiculous.
But to the median person, that's a big issue, right? That matters. You'd never get politicians talking about that here, because the two political bases who are very politically motivated and aware couldn't care less about the stupid sports stadium. Yeah. So that's a good example of kind of how the different systems lead to different debate.
Yeah. Well, perhaps let's take this thing global. Recently, Elon Musk has been criticised for suggesting a negotiation over the war in Ukraine. Now, you've written quite passionately about the current situation there. Your piece in The Australian got me a little worried. Is nuclear war on the cards?
Well, look, according to Joe Hockey, it's 30%. So that was a story I wrote in recent days. That's what he said to his clients. I certainly hope it's not that. But I just think that there's a sense in the debate about the war and how the US should respond. There's an air of frivolity about the possibility of nuclear war, as if it wouldn't affect us, it'd just affect other people. No. It would basically destroy everything. And look, I think it's a very remote chance, but even if it's a very remote chance, that's still a great concern. People make the valid point that it's not rational for Russia to do that, and it's not. But, humans are not 100% rational. I think emotion and passion guide a lot of our decisions much more than rationality. And so you don't know what's going on in Putin's head. He seems pretty cornered at the moment. He's 70. He's getting old. So he's lived an incredible life. Maybe that means he cares less about the future. I don't know. I'm just hypothesizing. And, Russia takes its claims to these areas very seriously. I think a lot more seriously than the rest of the world cares about them. Certainly the average person, couldn't care less. They wouldn't know where Donbass is. They wouldn't know where Ukraine is. So it's a very scary situation. It surprises me there's not even a starker fall in stock markets and so forth, because of the prospect of, very serious cataclysmic event. And I think these terrorist attacks on the bridge and the pipelines and all that sort of stuff is making it even more scary because it's humiliating Russia and him, and he doesn't like being humiliated. So yeah, look, I think it's very scary, and I wish the US would be kind of pushing for peace and trying to get some sort of settlement, which is what Elon Musk was trying to do in that tweet, and he was excoriated for it.
And what do you think of this sort of emboldening of Zelensky and the Ukraine? We've got so the bridge is one thing. We're to believe that there was also an assassination recently in Russia by possibly Ukrainian forces of a, was it like an oligarch's daughter or something like that?
Yeah, this is the reason why the US doesn't want to give them super long range missiles, because they'll say, oh, of course we won't shoot into Russia, but they might, and then it could be a very, very serious escalation, right? And that's the assassination is just a small scale example of that sort of a phenomenon that could happen. So yeah, look, Ukraine. Prior to the war, the media was very critical of Ukraine. It's corruption, and there are lots of articles about fascism there, and it's a shady past in the Second World War, and the treatment of the Russians in the East, and all sorts of stuff like that. That's not reported on anymore. Okay, obviously it's all gone. It's almost been whitewashed because there's a war on, and we've got to back our guys. So there's a lot of propaganda. In fact, a good point to make, I think, about the whole thing is we all know the first casualty of war is truth. I can't remember who said that, but it's a very good quote. And so pretty much now that there's a war on, you can't believe very much of what you read. Certainly Ukraine would have a massive vested interest in producing as much anti-Russian propaganda as possible. That's just expected and normal and rational. And Russia would have the same incentives, and the US has the same incentives. So I just find reading the news stories about the war, I kind of take it with a grain of salt. And some examples are, we heard for 6 months Putin was about to die of blood cancer or something, right? Well, it's clearly ridiculous. He hasn't died and it looks fine. So, where did that come from? Who was pushing that story? Or the thing about recently he stole school children or something. I personally found that completely absurd. It reminded me of the First World War propaganda when British, Australian, American media had pictures of Germans eating children. Both sides do that to really, rally the troops, so to speak. So anyway, the point is, we just don't know how this war is going to end. And if you read the Western press, you think that Russia's imminently going to lose. But I'm a bit more skeptical about that. And I thought what was very interesting was how Saudi Arabia, just a couple of weeks ago, and this is what really made me think, we keep hearing every day Russia's about to lose, and then Saudi Arabia very openly sides with Russia. That's very strange, right? Why would you side with a country that is about to collapse? That doesn't make any sense. And not only that, but side with a country against the US, which has been, your ally for many decades. It really, and that's why you saw yesterday President Biden said that the US is going to reevaluate its relations with Saudi Arabia, which could be very bad for Saudi Arabia. But clearly they thought it was better to side with Russia. So they clearly can't be reading the New York Times and CNN in Saudi Arabia, because if they had been, they would have realised Russia's going to lose next week.
They don't know that Russia's got a white supremacy problem as well, if they're not reading the New York Times.
Yeah. So anyway, my fear is this war goes for years and years.
Wow.
Because Russia's never going to withdraw from those provinces.
Yeah.
And it would happily lose tens of thousands of soldiers to keep it. And the interesting thing will be is if Republicans take control of one of the chambers in 3 weeks, does the money get turned off for Ukraine? Just remember, Congress controls the purse strings, and they could stop any further money going there.
It's the Democrats who are the hawks on this, right?
Yeah, look, there's hawks in both parties. The Trump side of the Republican Party is quite isolationist. I don't think they would be as involved. But yeah, I think the Democrats have become kind of the globalist warmonger type party, which is odd and weird. But yeah, I think that's fair. Look, I think in the case of Russia, though, they just hate Putin because they think he helped Trump in 2016. So there's this visceral hatred of him personally.
Are there still people holding on to that? Because that's...
Oh, yeah. I think it's obvious nonsense from first principles. Like, the idea of Putin's kind of micromanaging the US election is completely absurd. But no, it's an article of faith amongst a lot of Democrats that if it wasn't for Putin, Trump wouldn't have won, and that they're somehow, mates or something. It's very strange.
I'd be the first to admit that I know virtually nothing about Russia and UK and the Ukraine and their relations with each other and the history between those two countries. But amassing weapons on the Russian border, as has been done through NATO, isn't that a little like... It's kind of like the Cuban Missile Crisis where, the US wasn't too pleased about weapons on their border, so why should Russia be okay with that?
Well, yeah, look, the points I try to make is, I try to be a bit consistent about this and a bit fair, if you like. As you point out, firstly, the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is 60 years ago next week, I think, actually. The US put these missiles in Turkey, right? And Khrushchev was furious, so he put missiles in Cuba. And then the US was furious, and then there was almost nuclear war. And then the US, to its credit, to Kennedy's great credit, he agreed to withdraw the missiles from Turkey. And so Russia took its missiles away from Cuba. So it was problem solved. There was negotiation. Very wise, very, very wise. The world came extremely close to complete Armageddon. So that was a sign of great statesmanship. I'm not seeing too much of that now. It's if you say in the public domain, we should negotiate with Russia, or we should at least try to see the world the way they see it, you get called a traitor and a treason and a piece of shit and all this sort of stuff. I mean, it's extraordinary, actually. And just on the Russia question, I mean, who knows what the motivations really are? I mean, they say it's NATO related, and they were led to believe it's true, rightly or wrongly, for many decades that NATO would not expand eastward. And it did over and over and over again. And it's not just Putin, but Yeltsin, the former president, also said the same thing. He was very angry about it too, very angry about it. And for them, Ukraine was the last country that they could possibly... Well, they said that they would not accept NATO and Ukraine. Like, they just would not, because of its historical relationship with Russia and it's so close to Russia and all that sort of stuff. So they said that multiple times, and they actually said before the war started in February that they just wanted a guarantee from Ukraine and the rest of the world that Ukraine would never join NATO. And NATO and Ukraine said no, the US said no, and so they invaded. So, whose fault is that? Okay, Russia did invade, I agree, but they said they would if they did not get this other guarantee, which I think they should have tried. Why not give the guarantee and maybe there wouldn't have been a war? I mean, that would have been a big win in my view, especially since France and Germany said they were never going to let bloody Ukraine in NATO anyway. So, it was just so stupid to me. It was just this pride thing in the US that, oh no, Ukraine must have all the options of any other country. I mean, that's just not practical and not realistic. I mean, Russia is a great power, been around a long time. It's very powerful. You've got to respect that, whether you like them or not. That's just the reality of the world. The same with China. You might hate their system and think it's awful, as I do, but you've got to respect the country and its sphere of influence.
But I just go between these two poles of, sometimes I want to just do the whole give peace a chance chant, and then other times, like when this guy gets on TV and threatens nuclear war, part of me, a 90s action movie part of me just says, get the low-flying Black Hawks over there right now and take this. He's a bad hombre. He's got to go. So I don't know what to do.
Well, you've got to realise that he is a bad hombre, but he's quite likely, if he was taken out, to be replaced by someone even more hardcore. Putin is, at least in my view, from having read about him a lot and watched him, and I recommend to your listeners to watch the Oliver Stone 4-part series, the interviews with Putin at his various palaces in 2016. Very, very interesting. Very interesting. And you realise he's very educated, very rational and calm kind of individual. He's not an extremist. He just happens to think that this part of Ukraine is essential to Russia's future. Maybe he's wrong, maybe he's right. That's what he thinks. But my view is that I think the next leader would think the same thing. So point is, I think knocking him out is not going to help the situation. In fact, it could make it a lot worse. The West were, in many senses, welcoming Putin into their homes and everything for 20 years, kind of dealing with him, especially Germany.
Celebrities as well.
Almost fating him as a rational actor until 2014. And now suddenly he's a crazy madman. I mean, that's not logical.
Well, I like this quote that you put in one of your recent pieces from John F. Kennedy, who I think was quoting a military historian, that never corner an opponent and always assist him to save face, put yourself in his shoes. Now, in Eastern philosophy, I believe it's called extending a golden bridge to your opponent. Do we have a problem in the West in that our politicians just aren't of a very high caliber anymore? I mean, I can't imagine Biden or Harris pulling out a quote like that, nor figures like, Boris Johnson or our own Anthony Albanese. I couldn't imagine them being that well read,
Yeah, look, I think that's a good point. And that's a very profound, deep question. And I don't have an answer to it. I agree with the premise. The quality's gone down a lot. But, what is the cause of that? Is it because something I used to think, is it because the finance sector basically became so powerful it sucked out of all the most brilliant people who would have otherwise gone into politics or law, right? And that maybe is it. Not just finance, but consulting, all these extremely high-paying industries that never existed 50 years ago, right? They sucked away all the smart people, and you're just kind of left with the dregs a bit in politics. Maybe that's one explanation, or maybe it's just the general standard of education now is so poor compared to 50, 60 years ago, both at secondary, school, and also university. I mean, it's unbelievably low. Just back to the war, the only analogy you ever hear is the Second World War. I'm so sick of hearing about 1938 in Czechoslovakia. Is that the only thing that you people know? I mean, there's been so many wars in history, so many examples to cite upon. And the only debating point people make is, it's appeasement. Remember the Second World War? Well, that's one war out of, lots of wars. So people just don't have any historical memory. They've got no idea. Even the First World War, which I occasionally refer to, and I think is much more relevant to this particular case, because that crazy war started over some far-flung little province of an empire that no one knew where it was, and just through pride, basically, ended up sucking all of Europe into this shocking war for years, which everyone thought would be over really quickly, and it was not. It took 4 years, and millions died. So that's, I think that's a better example than the Second World War. But anyway. A lot of people, especially if they're under 40, they don't know anything about the First World War.
And what's the reaction been to your piece, particularly your apocalyptic piece about Russia?
Well, certainly amongst our readers at The Australian, who are pretty conservative, as you know, I think it was probably 50-50. A lot of people were upset that I'd taken that line, that I'd taken the so-called pacifist appeasement line, that I was Neville Chamberlain.
The pussy line. They're going, Adam's a pussy.
And also, he criticised Neville Chamberlain, but what was he supposed to do? That was probably the rational thing to do.
He was supposed to shoot Hitler under the table like Han Solo. He used to just go bang.
But we only criticise him with the benefit of hindsight. He didn't know what was going to happen. It was probably quite rational to try to make peace with this crazy man Hitler, even if it turned out badly. But anyway, that's a whole other historical issue. But yeah, it's you get a lot of flack on Twitter. I always do, but I got a lot over that. But I don't care. I've been saying stuff that annoys people for a long time. So,
but shouldn't I'm just interested because you took a I don't even know what to call it, a thoughtful position about COVID and the lockdowns, and here you are again, trying to find. Trying to do what journalists do, and I feel like there's hazards out there for anyone trying to do that like you are.
Yeah, no, it's an hysterical environment. There's this great tendency to denounce people who aren't with the majority as traitors or outsiders, or in the case of COVID, threats to the public health and all this sort of stuff. Pretty scary because that's always gone on, but it's much more scary with social media because it's so instant and the pile-on is so massive and people are so vicious. I did a tweet a few days ago. It always shocks me how vicious people are on Twitter to each other, to people they've never met. And they would never behave like that in person. I find that. So some Sydney law professor, who I'd never heard of, but he was a law professor at Sydney University, said some snide, snarky thing to me on Twitter. And I was kind of shocked. I'm like, man, you're meant to be a law professor at Sydney University. I actually said to him, would you talk to me like that in person? And of course, he was shocked that I wrote back rationally. But there's no way he would. No way. If we were at an event, you'd be polite, like anyone would be. And yet, for some reason, on social media, people are emboldened to just be horrible.
But to be fair, I've thought about this because I read your haters as well, and I read you and your haters, and I'm fascinated by how on Twitter something about that particular platform turns everyone into a total son of a bitch. Like, even people that I deeply respect, like that, like I see them on interviews, I go, I love you, I read your books, and then suddenly they go on Twitter and they're just punching people in the nuts all the time.
Yeah, no, it's true. It's true, and I don't know why. I think maybe it's just you only get so many characters. I don't know, it lends itself to grandstanding. It's the ultimate grandstanding platform. I mean, you saw through COVID so much grandstanding, just all these, kind of COVIDians or pro-lockdown people just talking about how much they care about old people. It makes me sick, actually. They couldn't give a stuff about old people. It's just, they just want to be seen to be virtuous. It's revolting. Anyway.
Well, I think I read somewhere recently that, is it California that's put a new bill forward that doctors are going to be penalised for misinformation?
It was signed a couple of weeks ago by the governor, which is pretty extraordinary. I thought he wouldn't sign it. It's crazy. But, now that there's this kind of broad power for doctors to be deregistered if they disagree with, if they tell their patients misinformation.
Yeah.
So if you're a doctor, it's really going to chill what you say to your patients, especially a new patient. You don't know, that patient could go off and tell the medical board that you've been spreading misinformation, and then you lose your entire career.
Yeah.
Pretty crazy stuff, especially since it's obviously stemmed from COVID, and the medical board there hates the fact that some doctors don't recommend the vaccines for certain for people of certain ages, which I think is a perfectly reasonable thing to suggest. But because the kind of medical authoritarianism we've been living in, there's only one right answer to everything.
Well, it seems to be spilling out into different areas as well, because I know PayPal now has in its updated terms and conditions that if you spread misinformation, that you can be fined $2,000 and thrown off the platform.
Yeah, well, they've walked that back. I mean, that was quite extraordinary. So they've said that was an accident, and it's not their policy. But it clearly was going to be until someone leaked it, and there was extraordinary blowback, as there should be. I mean, what? It's just crazy. I mean, who the hell do they think they are?
But that's a bit of a tactic, I find. Like, I think Facebook does a lot of this, where they sort of step over the line, they get some blowback, and they roll it back. But still, they're just getting a little bit closer to that line, every single time. They roll it back, but still they're getting closer.
That's definitely the trajectory we're all on. I mean, wow. I think the prospect of an Elon Musk takeover of Twitter and the removal of censorship, I think that's a very isolated case. That's not the general direction. You saw in Canada, everyone was quite happy for the Canadian government to freeze the financial accounts of people it didn't like. That's because of their political views. That was pretty extraordinary stuff.
That's what we do to warring countries and terrorists.
Yeah.
We did that to truckers.
And what scares me more with all this is that it's popular. It's popular. People love it. It's being a classical liberal or libertarian or whatever you want to call it is a lonely place to be most of the time. Only 10% of the population is ever going to agree with you, basically.
But what is this? Why are principles so hard to find nowadays? You know what I mean? This is the thing I grapple with all the time. I just want to ask everyone, what's the principal position here? What's the principal position? The people seem unable to answer that question. They always are keen to just go, well, what I want is the principal position. And you say, no, that's not the principal position. Why is this so elusive?
Yeah, look, it's a good question, and I agree with you. I think 50, 60 years ago, people were probably a lot more principled in politics than they are now. And why has that changed? I think, the first thing is, someone that studied economics, I always think it's got something to do with like wealth. And I think it does. We're just so rich now as a society in the West that nothing seems to matter as much anymore. Like, it's just life and death. There are very few life and death issues anymore, or there are very few people living in extreme poverty anymore. So there's a sense that, there's just a carefree sense, I think, about politics. I don't think politics matters as much as it used to, say. Well, they take it seriously in an identity sense, but I don't think they take it really seriously as they might have in the 1920s or 1930s when there were really big philosophical debates about how society should be run. I don't think there are any of those debates anymore. It's not a very good answer to your question.
No, it's a big sky question, and it needed a big sky answer. So maybe to circle it back to where we started, if you had to call these midterms, what would you be saying?
Oh, look, I think Republicans will win both chambers. and not by a lot. I think they really need to win the Senate for reasons I said earlier. It'd be very embarrassing if they don't for them. They only need to, obviously in net terms, win one seat. And the reason I say that is because I think polling is systematically biased against Republicans. And what reminded me of that was the polling in Brazil just last week. Of course, not Republicans, but conservative socialists, was out massively in favour of the socialists, massively, like shockingly, 13 percentage points. It was unbelievable. It wasn't just one poll, they all were. So everyone was like, Bolsonaro's going to lose by a lot. And he almost won. And now, if you look at betting markets for round 2 in a few weeks, he's predicted to win. I mean, just reminded me that polls can be systematically so wrong. And in the US, they were in 2016 too, remember? So I just think that in the US, your people are saying that they'll vote Democrat. They won't actually on the day. And that will get Republicans across the line.
Is that as simple as because if you have any other answer other than I love the Democrats and their whole platform, then people then you will be totally isolated?
Well, look, yeah, I think the media makes people feel guilty about being Republican by and large, and so that kind of filters out there. But people still have their own views, and when they vote privately. No one can see how they vote. So you get different outcome there. I mean, I think it's fair to say that 70% of the mainstream media, maybe 80%, is extremely pro-Democrat. So that's a very powerful force in society, I think, in moulding political outcomes. I mean, I do think if the left, the progressive left, didn't have the media, they'd never win an election because a lot of their policies are just increasingly crazy, like all the the trans stuff, the trans sports issues.
I've heard about it, yeah.
Stuff in schools and all that sort of crazy stuff. I mean, it's extremely alienating to ordinary people.
Well, what about the crime?
Sorry?
What about the crime, Adam?
Well, yeah, crime has gone up here. It's there's debates depending on which statistics you look at, but I think it's unambiguous that it's gone up significantly. I mean, what some Dems now try to say is, it's gone down a little bit from last year, but what they don't say is that the huge increase in the pandemic from 19 to 20 was extraordinary, and it just hasn't gone down. So that's the real story. So that gets back to lockdown policies. That the insanity of all that. But remember, in this country, they threw like 16 million people out of work in like a week or two. And so I think that's going to have an effect, on your social balance. And since they did that, you've had this level shift in crime. It's hard to get it down again, as history shows. But it's true that the Fox Newses of the world, they exaggerate things, but that's what all media always does.
I don't know, Adam. I've seen these videos. I mean, that I see on Twitter. I tell you what, I know that I'm being fed some of this stuff, but if you ask me how many hatchet attacks there should be, like say McDonald's or whatever, I would say there shouldn't be many, but there's more happening than I would have thought.
No, it's true, and it seems each day on Fox there's this new horrific video of something in the New York subway of just some innocent person just being beaten to death or stabbed. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, I can't. Twitter just shows it to me, like shoots it straight in my brain, and I feel really quite upset when I see.
Oh no, it's awful, and it's actually affecting people's decisions. I mean, I've got some friends who live in New York, and they don't get the subway anymore, just at all.
Yeah, so
because of this,
the 1970s.
I mean, they're quite wealthy, so they can get driving around. But the point is, it is actually changing people's behaviour. These videos, and even me. I mean, when I'm on the subway now in New York, I always, since that horrific story about 6 months ago of the poor Asian woman who was pushed in front of a train by that deranged black guy. It was horrible, just totally horrible. She was on her way to Deloitte to work or something, or Goldman Sachs or whatever it was. Professional woman minding her own business. There 1 minute and gone the next.
Oh my God!
Every time I'm on the platform, I'm now standing back and I'm looking around, because that'd be just such a horrible way to go. So horrible.
Yeah. Do you feel like a bit of a parochial though, because you're from Australia and nothing really happens here, and we're a bit frightened overall?
Yeah, definitely.
I'm worried that someone's going to hit me with a sock full of quarters.
Yeah. No, look, I mean, Australia has far less crime. Proportionately, it's a small place, and having lived here now for 1.5 years almost, you realise how kind of parochial it is back home, and there's not much to talk about. Not much really happens.
That's why we got to talk to you, man. Like,
it's
we don't have nothing going on here.
Fill the newspaper, right? Especially around Christmas, very difficult to fill a newspaper, and things that make the news back home would never make the news here, like never.
and then again, one of the things that happens there would be they do a year on it here. Like if it was like some of the dreadful stuff that I've seen would be, if it happened in Australia, like would just be huge.
Oh yeah, that's right. I mean, yeah, the threshold to be a crime story here is really high because there's so much of it. So much of it.
A group of girls the other day dressed up in green outfits and robbed people on the subway. That's another crazy subway. I know. They looked fabulous, and they stole all this stuff, and they've already been let out, I think. But so yeah, terrible stuff.
Yeah, we're very mindful of your time, Adam. So we might have to leave it there. But if people want to follow you, they can do that via Twitter.
Yep, yes, sorry, that's right. They can follow me at Adam_Creighton.
Be nice.
Yes, be nice.
Yeah, and they can abuse me there. That's the best place to abuse me.
I'm going to start white knighting I'm going to start defending you on Twitter. I'm going to do it.
That'd be nice. Some people do. Some brave little souls do.
All right, I'll join you.
Anyway, well, I hope I haven't said anything that'll get me sacked. I always worry about these.
Don't worry. We'll go down with you. It's okay.
Anyway, yeah.
All right.
Well, thanks for having me.
Thanks, Adam.
The chat.
We'll talk to you again.
Yeah, bye, guys.
Thank you for listening to the New Flesh podcast. If you like our work, please consider rating us on Apple Podcasts or even writing us a review. It really does help the show reach a wider audience. We'll be back with another episode next week. Until then, long live the New Flesh.